Hi, I'm Lanny, and this is Preserving Today. Hi guys, Lanny here from Greener Postures. I'm going to feed my sourdough starter, and so I'm going to show you how I do that now. This is my sourdough starter. I haven't fed this for 3 days, so I shouldn't have left it on the counter, but I did, and it's going to be okay. So this is now sourdough starter discard, and I'm just going to use some of it to continue my starter. And so this is what I call feeding. I have a digital scale. I'll link it in the description. It's cheap. It's really great. It actually is rechargeable, which is really cool. So I'm going to turn it on, and I'm going to make sure it's set to grams, which it is. And I'm going to place my jar. And in this case, I'm going to use a pint-sized jar because I'm only going to make a small amount of starter. This is just to keep my starter going. I'm not planning a big baking project. Once I have the jar on, I'm going to hit the tare button. And I'm going to get some water. And I'm going to just do 55 grams. Got a little bit on the scale, it's okay. That's 57 grams, I'm going with it. So I'm gonna do 25 grams of starter in this. So that's a 1-to-2 ratio that I'm going for. I'm going for 1 part sourdough starter to 2 parts water and 2 parts flour. And the reason I'm doing that is because I want my starter to be ready sooner than later, because I am gonna bake bread tonight. So this will give me over 100 grams of sourdough starter. So I'm gonna do 25 grams of the starter because that's gonna get it going faster, the 1-to-2 ratio. Whereas if I used 10 grams of starter to the same amount of flour and water, it would take longer because that bacteria would have more food to eat. If you have more bacteria, it has less food to eat. Hopefully that makes sense. These two starters were fed at the same time with the same flour and water and the same environment, but you can see they're much different after 5 hours. The only variable is the ratio of starter to the amount of flour and water. The jar on the left was fed 1 part starter to 2 parts water and 2 parts flour, a 1-to-2 ratio, still yielding 125 grams of finished starter. And the jar on the right was fed a 1 part starter to 5 parts water and 5 parts flour, a 1-5-5 ratio, yielding about 110 total. At peak and ready to bake in 5 hours is the 1-to-2 ratio, while the 1-5-5 is not going to be ready until about 12 hours. The jar fed the higher ratio of starter to flour and water will rise faster. Still don't get it because math? Well, just do your feeding with 10 grams of starter, 50 grams of water, and 50 grams of flour, and it'll be ready to bake with in about 12 hours. It's a great recipe to do before you go to bed if you want to start your bake in the morning. But even then, there are other factors at play, like the temperature in your house and the types of flour you're using. So you'll have to experiment yourself and see what works for you. For an even more detailed explanation, you can check out my post on preservingtoday.com. So I just hit tare again to get the scale back to 0 so that I can measure the weight of this. I'm going to go for 25. And see how runny that is? That is runny because it is so old. It's been sitting for a long time. So I actually got to 34 there. I'm okay with it because I want this to be ready really soon. And I'm just going to stir the water and the starter together. And I'm going to hit the tare button again. We're going to measure our flour. So the flour is going in. I just pre-measure this flour. I keep this in the cabinet so I don't have to go to my pantry to get flour out every time I feed. So this is just a mix of a couple kinds of einkorn flour, wheat and white. And I'm just gonna put 55 to 57 grams in here. There it is. And now I'm gonna stir really, really well. Stir, stir, stir until there's no dry left. This is gonna include scraping the sides down. For this, I really prefer this spatula. There's no seams in it, so it's easy to clean and it's not going to get dough stuck in the little cracks of some place. So it's my favorite. It's also kind of long and narrow, and it is a spatula, so you can really scrape the sides well because it's a little rubbery and bendy. I'll link to that in the description. So there's my sourdough starter fed. So this is my sourdough starter discard now. This is the part that I don't need. I'm not baking with it. It's not risen. It's just going to go in the fridge and I'm going to use it to make other things. I already had a jar of sourdough starter discard in the fridge. It's getting older. I don't want to pour this on top because then the oldest stuff will be on the bottom. So to rotate and keep a cleaner jar, I'm going to now use this jar from my fridge, pour all of the older stuff on top, and wash this jar Got all that out in there. So now this is the discard that's gonna go back in my refrigerator. You can use that for pancakes or waffles or pizza crust. There's a lot of good recipes to use discard, tons of them. This is my starter, and now I'm gonna use this rubber band to mark where the starter is in the jar right now, roughly, right? And that's gonna show me when the starter rises, and I'll know I want it at least doubled in size. Actually, when I feed mine, if I let them go, they get a little more than doubled. So that's it, that's how I feed my sourdough starter. I think a lot of people think when you're saying feed your sourdough starter that they're assuming that you could just put something into the jar. And in this case, we're actually starting the food in a new jar and moving some of the starter into the food. So instead of putting food into the existing starter, it's the opposite. The reason being is if you just kept adding more food to the same amount of starter, there'd be too much bacteria for the amount of food and they would starve. So you have to get a smaller sample of the yeast culture, the bacteria, and move that into the new food source. That's the best way I've found to do it. There are a lot of ways to feed your starter. This is how I do it. And if you have any questions, please be sure to let me know. Thank you for watching.